In this short presentation of some basics of plant selection and sensitivity, we're going to be talking about several things related to selecting plants for your landscape. Some of the basics here include identifying where plants belong in the landscape. Very important part of landscape contracting is to understand some plants fit specific places, others perhaps do not. So in this picture of a typical residential landscape, we're seeing 5 specific areas of the landscape that maybe a plant would exist. Starting off with screening hedge. A screening hedge typically is evergreen, but there are some deciduous plants that may fit this situation. A specimen plant, in this case, a magnolia. This is a southern magnolia. It's not only evergreen, but it has fragrant white flowers, so it's very distinctive in this particular location in the landscape. Most of the time, specimen plants are just one plant, and rarely maybe 3 plants in a cluster. Foundation plants tend to be a group of plants that are monoculture, similar to a screen or hedge, but these are low growing, usually no more than the height of a foundation, 2 to 3 foot tall, and as the name implies, they grow and are located along the foundation of a home or a business. Shade trees, a very common landscape feature in most landscapes. Shade trees tend to be deciduous plants that provide shade during the summer. They're often located on the south or southwest of a property to provide some extra energy saving to that particular house. And finally, ground covers. Ground covers tend to be a group of plants that are low growing, no more than 10 or 12 inches tall. Spread could be anywhere from 12 to 24, maybe even further in their spread. Ground covers tend to be mass planting in and under shade trees or in and under shrubs to kind of complement those, but also to prevent your mower getting too close to those plants. Ground cover is kind of a layer of plants that helps cool the soil and give you some texture to that area of the landscape. So when we're talking about matching plants to site, there's 2 terms that we need to think of. Are they native or are they indigenous? These terms are interchangeable sometimes. Plants are native to ecosystems, not to geopolitical regions. On the other hand, plants may be also indigenous to a wide range of geographical regions with similar climatic conditions. So a plant may be native to North Carolina or indigenous to North Carolina, depending on your perspective. But a plant is not tied to particular states or regions, and they're more related to ecosystems. Genotype versus phenotype. Now these are 2 more terms. Genotype plants are of the same genera or species regardless of where they're found. Phenotype plants are also the same genera or species but from the same latitude. So with genotype plants, we may have a plant such as Acer rubrum, a red maple, that is hardy or native to Portland, Maine, as well as to Tampa, Florida. Now, genotypically, they are the same genus and species, but phenotypically, they are of different latitudes. So that Acer rubrum that originated in Portland, Maine would not perform well or live in Tampa, Florida because of the different latitudes and vice versa. Phenotype plants are going to be plants that came from the same latitude. So plants in western North Carolina are typically the same latitudes that plants are in the upstate of North Carolina or in parts of the central North Carolina. So let's look at 3 other terms when we talk about plant selection. Native plants, adapted plants, and invasive plants. Now, native plants naturally occur in a region or ecosystem without human intervention. Yes, we can adopt those and put them in our landscapes, or we can protect the existing ones in our landscapes. But typically, native plants in the U.S. are considered to be plants that were here before the European settler. Adapted plants are plants that may be either non-native and introduced from other areas of the world or within the same state. And finally, invasive plants are typically non-native introductions that may cause other plants to be displaced, such as this kudzu. Kudzu was brought here deliberately in the 30s and 40s or 1900s, and it was often used for erosion control and as a legume for feeding livestock. It become invasive, and actually in this case of the picture, you see it covering up trees and even a home. So when we match plants to site, we need to think about choosing plants that have similar environmental requirements, choosing plants that will adapt to that area, or modify the site if it's economically feasible. Typically, this is a very expensive process. Or finding plants that will fit the environmental conditions of the site tends to be the best choice. When we choose plants grown in nurseries with similar environmental conditions, we typically are going to find plants that perform better in our particular location. So, what are we trying to achieve when we make these choices in plant selection sensitivity? We have various kinds of gardens. Perhaps we're planting for wildlife food, such as a pollinator garden, or we're planting plants for the birds. Perhaps we're planting plants for erosion control, foundation plantings, formal gardens, hedges, borders, or sound or view buffers. Maybe we're planting plants for an edible landscape, so we're choosing plants that have edible fruits, edible foliage, or other portions of the plant. Perhaps we have a shade garden we're putting in, so we have to find plants that actually tolerate various levels of shade. Maybe we're putting in a garden for the visually impaired or other horticultural therapy. And finally, we may have some other energy-saving reasons to put this garden in. Stormwater remediation is another thing that we look at as landscapers. Rain gardens, riparian buffers, bioremediation areas, and those kind of things. And finally, remember, be sure to take the short quiz and read any supplemental materials before you move on to the next presentation or video.